want me to beg?
Violence in video games isn't new, but some titles pushed the boundaries so far that even Manhunt looks tame by comparison. These aren't just games with a few bloody scenes. These are full-blown descents into madness, moral chaos, and over-the-top brutality that shocked players and censors alike. From open-world rampages and psychotic first-person shooters to twisted horror nightmares drenched in gore, these games became infamous for what they dared to show and sometimes for what they made you do. Whether it was for the sake of satire, horror, or sheer chaos, each of these releases left a stain on gaming history that still hasn't been scrubbed clean. So, let's dive into 12 of the most violent, disturbing, and downright controversial games that somehow went further than Manhunt and got away with it. Postal 2. When it comes to violent video games that sparked genuine moral panic, Postal 2 stands near the top. Developed by Running with Scissors and released in 2003, this first-person sandbox shooter was unapologetically nihilistic. Set in the fictional town of Paradise, Arizona, the game allows players to step into the shoes of the Postal Dude, a sarcastic and unhinged man navigating his normal week. On paper, you're just completing mundane errands like buying milk, picking up a paycheck, and returning library books. Still, in practice, every errand can erupt into chaos depending on how you play. You could follow the rules and complete objectives peacefully, or you could use everything from shovels and scissors to gasoline and cats as silencers to slaughter civilians. The game's dark humour pushed boundaries, mixing slapstick absurdity with disturbing realism. Characters screamed in agony, civilians vomited in terror, and blood pooled in ridiculous quantities. Postal 2 utilised Unreal Engine 2, which was relatively advanced at the time, enabling interactive environments and reactive NPCs that remembered your crimes. The game was banned in multiple countries, including New Zealand and Australia, due to its gross, abhorrent content. Critics slammed it for mindless violence, yet it built a loyal cult following that saw it as satire. Some even called it a grotesque reflection of American society's obsession with violence and free speech. Despite the controversy, Postal 2 endured. It later received expansions: Apocalypse, Weekend, Paradise Lost, and VR mods that only amplified its chaos. Hatred. Few games have ever generated outrage on the scale of Hatred. Released in 2015 by Polish studio Destructive Creations, this isometric twin-stick shooter was immediately banned from Steam Greenlight upon announcement, accused of crossing a moral line even Manhunt never touched. Where other violent games at least frame the player's actions within a story or survival, Hatred strips everything down to one chilling premise. You play as a sociopathic killer embarking on a mass murder spree because life is pointless. There's no redemption arc, no narrative justification. It's just cold, methodical violence. The nameless protagonist stalks suburban neighbourhoods, police stations, and army bases, executing civilians and law enforcement with a disturbing sense of purpose. The black and white visual palette, accented by splashes of red, enhances the nihilistic tone, while the deep, growling voice of the protagonist adds to the game's unsettling atmosphere. The gameplay revolves around execution mechanics, performing brutal finishes to regain health, and using realistic weapon physics to wreak havoc in fully destructible environments. Despite widespread bans and being rated adults only by the ESRB, a rating so rare it nearly killed its release. The controversy ironically fueled its success. Once Valve reinstated it on Steam, Hatred sold over 1 million copies, thriving off its own infamy.
He is the key to the gate of unending agony. She is the answer.
Agony Unrated. If Hatred was nihilism on Earth, Agony Unrated drags players straight into the depths of hell and then goes several circles deeper. Developed by the Polish studio Madmind Games, this first-person survival horror game was originally released in 2018. The unrated edition restores all the extreme violence and explicit content censored from the base release. It's a horrifying fever dream built from torment, sexuality, and despair. Players awaken as a lost soul, condemned to hell, stripped of memory and humanity. The goal is to find and confront the Red Goddess, the ruler of this infernal realm, in hopes of escaping eternal damnation. Every corridor of agony feels alive, pulsating with flesh, blood, and screams. The level design turns hell into a surreal labyrinth of organic tunnels and screaming walls. Demons wander, mutilating the damned in graphic, ritualistic ways, while the player uses possession mechanics to inhabit other souls and demons to survive temporarily. Agony Unrated isn't just infamous for the gore, but also for the disturbing creativity behind it. Skinned bodies form bridges, crying infants are used as tools, and entire sections feel designed to break taboos rather than scare in a traditional sense. The restored unrated content includes fully uncensored violence, nudity, and torture sequences originally deemed too extreme for console release. Mortal Kombat. After years of uneven spin-offs and failed experiments, Mortal Kombat 2011, often called Mortal Kombat 9, brought the franchise roaring back with a vengeance. Developed by NetherRealm Studios, this reboot was an explosion of blood, bone, and nostalgia that reminded the world why Mortal Kombat was once the most controversial name in gaming. The story takes place after Armageddon, where Raiden, moments before his death, sends a message back in time to his younger self, triggering a complete reboot of the timeline. What follows is a reimagined version of the first 3 games, told through a cinematic campaign that blends campy martial arts fantasy with gruesome next-gen violence. Each fighter from Scorpion and Sub-Zero to Melina and Noob Saibot was redesigned with modern visuals and more realistic gore. The real showstopper was the return of the X-ray attacks, brutal slow-motion sequences showing shattered bones, ruptured organs, and crushed skulls in graphic detail. The fatalities were pushed to new extremes, Kung Lao slicing foes in half with his hat, Noob tearing enemies apart with shadows, and Melina devouring victims alive. The game's enhanced engine made every ounce of pain disturbingly tangible. Critics praised its tight combat system, smooth controls, and strong single-player mode, calling it the perfect balance between arcade chaos and modern polish. Soldier of Fortune. Before Call of Duty and Battlefield turned military shooters into blockbuster spectacles, Soldier of Fortune carved its own bloody path through the FPS world. Released in 2000 by Raven Software and powered by the Quake 2 engine, this game became infamous for its unprecedented use of realistic dismemberment, a system so detailed that it earned notoriety and bans around the world. Players assume the role of John Mullins, a mercenary hired to stop a global terrorist organisation from using stolen nukes. The plot, though serviceable, is secondary to the visceral action. Soldier of Fortune had something called the Ghoul Damage Model, a revolutionary system that divided human bodies into 26 separate zones. Every bullet impact had a physical effect. Heads exploded, limbs tore off, and enemies reacted with disturbingly lifelike agony. Each mission took players through gritty urban war zones and black market facilities, blending stealth with intense gunfights. Weapons like the M4, Spas-12, and AK-74 were rendered with realistic physics and sound, giving the game a brutal sense of authenticity. The violence felt personal, with close quarters combat pushing players to confront the horror of what they were doing. Critics praised its tight gunplay and advanced AI, but were divided on the gore. Some saw it as a technical breakthrough. Others called it snuff-level realism. Countries like Germany and Australia have outright banned it. Yet, despite the controversy, Soldier of Fortune spawned 2 sequels and earned cult classic status among fans of realistic shooters.
Let me go.
Say something to save your life.
Oh man, I just crapped my...
The Punisher. If you ever wondered what it'd feel like to step into the boots of Marvel's most brutal vigilante, The Punisher, 2005, didn't just answer that, but it also dared the players to embody it. Developed by Volition and published by THQ, this third-person action game took Frank Castle's war on crime to its darkest extremes, blending comic book vengeance with disturbingly realistic violence. Taking on the role of Frank Castle, a former Marine turned vigilante, players could hunt down gangsters, drug lords, and human traffickers across New York's underworld. The story loosely follows Welcome Back, Frank and the Punisher film starring Thomas Jane, who also voices the character. Gameplay-wise, it mixes cover-based shooting with brutal close-quarters interrogation mechanics, which was arguably the most infamous part of the game. Instead of simple combat, players can drag enemies to interrogation points scattered through levels like buzzsaws, acid vats, piranha tanks, even wood chippers, and extract information in real time. These sequences were so graphic that the game received an adults-only rating before Marvel insisted on censoring certain kills with black and white filters. Even with toned-down visuals, The Punisher remained one of the most violent superhero games ever made. Weapons included everything from pistols and assault rifles to melee objects like pipes and knives, letting players improvise their own brand of punishment. Missions took Castle from seedy docks to crack houses and mob mansions, each dripping with grim atmosphere. Though The Punisher may not have reinvented the genre, it delivered something few licensed games dared: unflinching, unapologetic violence wrapped in moral ambiguity. Carmageddon. In an era when racing games were all about speed and trophies, Carmageddon flipped the wheel and said, "What if we just ran everyone over instead?" Released in 1997 by Stainless Games, this vehicular combat title was one of the first to mix driving with pure destruction. Inspired by the cult film Death Race 2000, it transformed car racing into an anarchic blood sport, rewarding players for mowing down pedestrians as much as for completing laps. The premise was simple and twisted. You compete in violent races across open maps, but victory doesn't depend on crossing the finish line. You can win by annihilating your rivals' vehicles or by literally killing every pedestrian on the map. Cars were armed with spikes, saws, and even flamethrowers, turning city streets into slaughterhouses. Pedestrians screamed, splattered, and ragdolled across the screen. The game used a dynamic physics system that made every collision feel visceral. Blood splashed across your windshield, cars crumpled realistically, and power-ups added absurdity, like turning your victims into exploding chickens or flipping gravity. The carnage was so extreme that the game was banned or heavily censored in multiple countries, with some releases replacing humans with robots or green-blooded aliens. Critics were both horrified and impressed. Beneath the chaos, Carmageddon offered surprisingly deep mechanics, open-ended tracks, and a wicked sense of humour. It became a cult hit, spawning sequels and a remaster decades later. Outlast 2. Outlast may have pushed the boundaries of horror, but when Outlast 2 came out, it tore them apart and drenched them in blood. Released in 2017 by Red Barrels, this first-person survival horror game took everything that made its predecessor terrifying and amplified it tenfold. It ditched the claustrophobic asylum setting for something far more sinister. A remote desert village where a fanatical cult believes the apocalypse is at hand. You play as Blake Langerman, a journalist searching for his missing wife, Lynn, after their helicopter crashes in the Arizona wilderness. Armed only with a camcorder, Blake must navigate cornfields, tunnels, and nightmarish ruins while documenting the horrors around him. The camera's night vision mechanic returns, forcing players to conserve batteries while seeing through total darkness, creating constant tension between safety and sight. Unlike most horror games, Outlast 2 offers no weapons or combat options. Survival depends on hiding, running, and sheer luck. The game's violence and religious overtones pushed boundaries to the level that even seasoned horror fans found it hard to digest. Themes of cult sacrifice, child mutilation, and religious delusion are depicted in brutal detail. Every chase and scream feels relentless, and the lack of defense turns every encounter into a state of pure panic. Critics praised its visuals, atmosphere, and relentless intensity, although some felt that its shock factor overshadowed the storytelling. Fans, however, recognized it as a spiritual successor to Manhunt in tone, which is a raw depiction of human evil masked by faith. Mad World. While most developers tried to tone down violence for the Nintendo Wii's family-friendly image, Mad World went in the complete opposite direction. Released in 2009 by Platinum Games and published by Sega, it's a stylized, over-the-top brawler that turned cartoon gore into high art. The entire game is rendered in stark black and white, with only blood-red colour standing out. The game puts you in the boots of Jack Kamen, a chainsaw-wielding anti-hero and contestant in a televised death game called Deathwatch, where killing creatively earns you points and sponsorship deals. The game rewards you for combining environmental traps, impaling foes on spikes, stuffing them into dumpsters, or launching them into moving trains and stringing them together for higher scores. Mad World stood out for the presentation of its violence. The cel-shaded art style mimics comic books and graffiti, creating a surreal world where violence looks simultaneously absurd and beautiful. The soundtrack was a pounding mix of rap and industrial rock, amplifying the chaos, while commentary from in-game announcers provides darkly comedic play-by-play reactions. Although the game didn't sell huge numbers, it earned cult status and paved the way for Platinum Games' later hits such as Bayonetta. Manhunt 2. The first Manhunt shocked the audience, and Manhunt 2 pushed things to an even darker, more psychologically extreme level. Released in 2007 by Rockstar Games, it took the concept of human depravity and moral collapse to disturbing new levels. While the original game focused on cold-blooded execution for sport, Manhunt 2 turned inward into the fractured psyche of a man who no longer knows what's real. Your character is of one Daniel Lamb, a scientist from a secret government project called the Pickman Bridge Initiative. After escaping a mental asylum during a blackout, Daniel is plagued by hallucinations and guided by a mysterious voice named Leo Casper. As the game unfolds, it becomes clear that Leo is a projection of Daniel's own violent split personality. The gameplay retains the stealth kill core of the original, sneaking through grimy alleys and derelict buildings, improvising weapons from shards of glass, crowbars, or piano wire. Manhunt 2 also introduced contextual execution sequences, requiring players to move the Wii remote or analog sticks in rhythm to brutally dispatch enemies. The violence was so graphic that Rockstar had to heavily censor the game to avoid an adults-only rating. The uncut PC version later revealed executions in full, complete with first-person dismemberments and camera distortion effects meant to simulate Daniel's unstable mind. Beyond the gore, Manhunt 2 tried to explore themes of control, sanity, and guilt, questioning whether Daniel was a killer or a victim of manipulation. This psychological angle gave the violence an unnerving emotional core, which wasn't just for shock, but part of the narrative descent. The Suffering. Released in 2004 by Surreal Software and published by Midway, The Suffering blended psychological horror with brutal action in a way few games dared to at the time. Set in the grim confines of Abbott State Penitentiary, the game follows Torque, a death row inmate accused of murdering his wife and children. The twist, however, is that he doesn't remember doing it, and throughout the game, you're never entirely sure if he's guilty or haunted by something far worse. The fusion of gritty realism and monstrous symbolism made the game stand out. The prison becomes overrun with horrific creatures, each one representing a specific method of execution, turning the entire environment into a living metaphor for guilt and punishment. The violence seemed to purposefully reflect the darkness in human nature and the consequences of our actions. Gameplay balances fast-paced shooting and melee combat with psychological elements. Talk can unleash a monstrous transformation fueled by rage, allowing players to become the embodiment of his inner demon, literally. Choices made during dialogue and combat significantly impact the ending, determining whether Talk is considered innocent, guilty, or beyond redemption. This moral system lent the carnage emotional weight, a rarity in early 2000s horror games.
He's like an Uber killer, a serial killer X, a perp not on your original case list.
So, this serial killer X kills serial killers.
Condemned Criminal Origins. Condemned Criminal Origins took violence to a dimension rooted in raw, disturbing realism rather than over-the-top gore. Developed by Monolith Productions and released for the Xbox 360 and PC, this first-person psychological horror game focused on brutal melee combat, crime scene investigation, and an oppressive atmosphere that blurred the line between killer and victim. Players stepped into the shoes of FBI agent Ethan Thomas, framed for murder and hunting a serial killer through decaying buildings, dark alleys, and subway tunnels filled with deranged vagrants and murderers. Instead of flashy guns or superpowers, you fought for survival with whatever you could find: pipes, planks, crowbars, or axes, each strike landing with bone-crunching realism. The sound design was visceral. Every impact felt weighty and personal. Blood splatter and screams echoed through the empty corridors, enhancing the claustrophobic tension. There were firearms, but ammo was scarce, forcing players into savage face-to-face encounters that felt uncomfortably real. Beyond combat, Condemned was celebrated for its immersive investigation mechanics and psychological themes. Using forensic tools, players analysed evidence and pieced together clues while battling their own paranoia. As Ethan's mind fractured, the game's world became more surreal and disturbing, suggesting that the horror might be as much internal as external.
We did it.
Marvelous verdict. When people talk about violence in video games, Manhunt is usually the first name to drop. But as we've seen, it's far from the worst offender. From Postal 2's crude chaos to Agony's hellish torment and Hatred's unapologetic nihilism, these games trampled right over every boundary possible. Each one tested the limits of censorship, taste, and player endurance, often sparking debates about art, morality, and how far games should really go in the name of freedom. Whether you see them as social experiments, dark satire, or just pure insanity, one thing's certain: they left a mark that still bleeds through modern gaming culture. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like, drop a comment with the most disturbing game you've ever played, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into gaming's wildest and bloodiest corners.